Velkommen alle sammen. You know, in 2.5 years, I've never had this problem yet on the YouTube channel before now. I've heard other pagan-themed YouTubers getting hate from Christians, the other monotheistic religions, but I've never experienced something like this in my life. I have a lot of Christian friends, good people, whether I meet them online or in person, strangers, friends, whatever, and they're all very kind when they find out my beliefs, but a couple weeks ago, someone tainted the comments section of one of my videos with their stupidity, and I've never seen such lack of brain function as in this comment, and that's really saying a lot. This creature who passes for a human being was actually managing to use his smartphone to type in not one but 2 sentences, just like the rest of us do, somehow in his vegetative state, and he typed out, "Christians never forced their religion on anyone in Europe. The medieval Europeans accepted Christianity willingly." I'll wait so you guys can all have a laugh. Christians never forced their religion on anyone. I'm not even going to waste any more brain power on this. Let's just get straight to the sources. I'm breaking it down into all the Germanic countries, because that's what this channel is all about. The native beliefs of the Germanic peoples. And besides, if I had to go over every place in the world that Christianity forced their beliefs on, we would be here for a week trying to speak about all of those examples. So we're just speaking about the Germanic peoples here, and different countries and how Christianity was forced. So let's start with the Franks, actually. They were a Germanic people too, and one of the first to convert in about the late 400s. They're at least the actual large nation. You know, the Goths were definitely Christian before then, and Vandals and some other smaller Germanic tribes seem to have been Christianized peacefully. At least we have no records of them being violently converted. But Frankish King Clovis, who was a pagan actually, but his wife was a Catholic priestess. So they got married and had a happy relationship together, but his wife baptized their children against the pagan King Clovis's wishes, and the children actually both died right after their baptism, both sides. So it made Clovis definitely not want to convert even more after knowing that. But one day, Clovis was invaded by Christian Alemanni peoples trying to convert the Franks, and the story goes that Clovis was losing the battle when he made his first prayer to the Christian god here. So whether this is all true or not, we don't know, but that's at least what the history book says, and then Clovis was baptized after that and introduced Christianity to the Franks. And this is actually the most mellow of all the Germanic conversions, but I wouldn't exactly say they were peacefully converted there either. Next, let's go to the Anglo-Saxons. They actually took some time to convert over a period of many hundreds of years, actually, but it started at least in the late 500s, we think, maybe a little bit earlier. A writing by Gregory the Great, dated to the year 601, basically details instructions of how to go about converting the pagans of Anglo-Saxon England. It says, "Do not let them sacrifice animals to the devil, but let them slaughter animals for their own food to the praise of God." He also writes about how some of the religious authorities were urged to get people to celebrate the pagan feasts and holidays on a day that was a Christian holy day, and then they just renamed it after a saint, as we know they did. This is a typical example of the church trying to just slightly change something that was pagan, but it was originally a pagan ritual. Christmas, Midsummer, Easter. This is just a few examples of these things. And in this same source, he also instructs the leaders of the church to build Christian churches on top of pagan temples and sacred sites, so people would go there. A lot of pagans don't like this actually, but if you go to these really old churches, especially if you're in Europe, if you go to these very, very old churches, a lot of those were built right on pagan sacred sites, so these are some of the places that were deemed as sacred, so they are actually a great place to go. Next, we have a penitential written by the Archbishop of Canterbury, Theodore, And we find more than one example there of the church forcefully baptizing children after their birth, and their pagan parents resisting this, and it came to violence, and it even came to sometimes killing or abandoning their children because they didn't want them to be baptized. Very brutal, and of course that's not a good thing to do, but it just shows how passionate the Anglo-Saxon pagans were about their native religion and the lengths that the Christians were trying to get to force their beliefs on the pagans there. Another example is when the English bishop Wilfrithi, the very famous account, there was a woman who had 2 children, and one of her children died during birth and the other one lived. She brought the dead child to be baptized, actually, to try and trick the bishop into letting the dead one be baptized while the living one was not. And both of those sources, by the way, come from just before the year 700, so Christianity was still not accepted at that time. Last one I'll go over is a pretty funny one. Bishop Polnius of York wrote about King Edwin and his army, who was on their way to forcefully convert another area of England to Christianity. And on the way, King Edwin and his army sees a crow cawing on a fence. The king and his men all believe this bird to be an important omen, as pagans do. And then they stop, and they try to listen what the bird is saying. And the bishop condemns this pagan practice and kills the crow with a stone. So even though the king had accepted Christianity, he still did this pagan practice of listening to birds. So this is all we have the written evidence of. There might be a couple others that I missed. In Anglo-Saxon England, and again, it's not like massacres and blood used to convert the Anglo-Saxons as much as other places, but it still forced people did not just accept it willingly as a superior belief system, and it took many hundreds of years for people to actually truly accept it. Even as late as the 1000s, there were still laws in effect and being enforced prohibiting pagan belief and custom, so we know that people were doing it anyway at that time. Paganism had not died out. So now we're getting onto the really brutal stuff, and that is the Saxons. The Saxon Wars was basically a genocide from the Catholic Roman Emperor Charlemagne against the Saxons living in modern-day Germany. They're trying to convert them to Christianity when they were willing to suffer horrible fates to keep their freedom of beliefs. There are tons of examples I could go into here. There are some sources here that you can read about yourself. You know, tens of thousands of lives lost, executions, villages burned down, people tortured, women being captured. We can go into it all day about the horrible things Charlemagne did, but here are just a few of the most famous ones that many of you might have heard of. The Franks invaded Saxon territory and destroyed their sacred symbol Irminsul in the year 772. Irminsul was the Mecca of the Germanic peoples. It was a very sacred place that we think was either a very large tree trunk or pillar that reached high into the sky, and that was a central area of a sacred place, like the main sacred place of the Germanic peoples from the time. And the Franks killed everyone there who defended it, and they subjugated any survivors, and Charlemagne used his entire army to take this thing down. So whatever it was, it must have been huge. We think it's actually this thing here, the Externsteine in Germany. In the following years, Charlemagne also invaded and conquered Saxon areas of Westphalia, Eastphalia, Engria, Sigeburg, and Eresburg, and pretty much most of what is today modern northern Germany. And Charlemagne himself assisted in mass baptisms, forcing hundreds or thousands of people to be baptized, or else they would be killed on the spot. Charlemagne also set up laws giving the death penalty for anyone who was practicing pagan traditions or believed in these native traditions. Even though Charlemagne's close advisors, Alcuin of York and the later abbot Tours, they actually advised Charlemagne to be a bit more lenient. They thought he was even taking it a little bit overboard, since they said God's word should be spread not by the sword but by persuasion. And that's great. That's all well and good advice, but Charlemagne obviously did not listen to that, and the wars continued. The Saxons, it's worth noting that the Saxons were not an easy target, and they fought back hard for many decades. But anytime the Saxons won a battle, Charlemagne took it out on the civilians. Once at the blood court of Verden, he ordered the beheading, the executions of 4,500 Saxons, all in a matter of days, so this was a massacre. Not very peacefully converted the Saxons were. There you go. Next, we can speak about the Frisians, or the ancestors of the people of today living in modern-day Netherlands area. In the Frisian Wars, it was the same thing as the Saxon Wars. It was right about the same time, Charlemagne coming in and forcing Catholicism on them. And the Frisians actually teamed up and fought together with the Saxons against Charlemagne a lot during this time. It was the same thing: massacres, forced baptisms, laws giving the death penalty for paganism, all the same types of things. But just to go over a couple examples, Donna's Oak is the one that most of you might have heard of. Saint Boniface destroyed the Frisian pagan temples and sacred places all over, but the highlight of it was Donna's Oak that he cut down, or Thor's oak tree, which was believed to be the most sacred tree of the time, where it was central for religious worship and gatherings and things like that. Another event was the Battle of Born, where the Frisians were defeated by the Franks, and their king Poppo was executed, and the Franks plundered and burned all the pagan temples and sanctuaries around the area. Again, the Frisians fought hard, and many victories too, and there was a lot more than this done. I'm just giving a couple examples, because the Frisians too were forced to accept Christianity. Now let's move on to Scandinavia. We can start with Denmark. The Christianization of Denmark is told differently in a couple different sources. Some sources say that they were done more peacefully than others, but either way it wasn't by choice. It was by forced. My favorite source comes in Heimskringla. Harald Bluetooth, King of Denmark, was still pagan at the time. This is the late 900s. The Saxon Holy Roman Emperor Otto was invading Denmark, trying to forcefully Christianize them. Harald Bluetooth fought back, and he enlisted the help of the Norwegians, and they won the first battle, but later on the Danes fought the Saxons by themselves and the Emperor Otto, and they lost, and they were forced to be baptized. The Danes and the Saxons also forced the Norwegians that were there too to be baptized, and Norway was under Danish rule at the time, so by law, in effect, and all of Norway would have become Christian at that time by forcefully doing that, but everyone hated Harald and how cowardly he was for converting. They sung songs about him. See my video that I did on that. Even his own son, Svein Forkbeard, stole the rule back from Harald because he was a pagan, and people loved him more than they loved his father, who forced Christianity upon the country. After that, Denmark in the following decades or hundreds of years slowly accepted Christianity, although the initial catalyst was by force. And laws came on a bit later on prohibiting paganism, but it seems to be overall not as brutal as the Saxon Wars, for example. Norway, different story, very brutal. As I mentioned the first time, it was Harald Bluetooth who forced Christianity on Norway, but they fought off his attempts pretty easily. The real problem came with the two Norwegian kings, the two Olavs as I call him. Olav number 1 was Olav Tryggvason, who used kind of lies and sneaky tricks to get his way to the Norwegian throne. And when he was king, he tried to convert the people of Norway peacefully until his army was strong enough, and then he used violence once he had enough power to do so. He destroyed pagan temples, statues, and we have a few examples of him using torture to convert the people of Norway. He did this with thousands of people most likely, but the famous one that you have all probably heard of is where he tried to convert Edard the Strong, a powerful chieftain that didn't want to convert to Christianity as Olav wanted. So Olav proceeded to use a hot iron rod to force a snake down Edard's mouth, and then the snake ate its way out of Edard's insides. A gruesome death there. Then we have Olav number 2. Olav the Saint, Olav Haraldsson, who used again trickery to kind of gain the crown of Norway, and Olav went from village to village with his army, forcing people to convert or die, and he even sneakily smashed a pagan statue of a god while others were looking away at something else, and he said that it was Jesus that did it, so our God is more powerful than yours. Jesus just smashed your god's statue. So of course both of these Olavs were killed. A bit later on the Norwegians rose up and fought both times and defeated them, but Norway too slowly became Christian after that. Finally, last one, we can speak about Sweden, which was the last Germanic country in Europe to become Christian. Early attempts on converting Sweden were actually done pretty peacefully and friendly. Archbishop Ansgar very early in the 830s, and Archbishop Unni in about the year 930, 940. They made unsuccessful attempts, but it was largely peaceful. They just kind of came in and they built a church and tried to preach to people, so that's all well and good. But even in the late 1000s, Christians and pagans in Sweden were living peacefully. It was actually a law that chieftains had to come to the big pagan sacrifice at Uppsala every year, and Christians who didn't want to come to that were free to do so, but they had to pay a fee to be exempt. So there's one of the few instances we have of pagans and Christians living peacefully in a collaborating society like that. So that's great. But eventually, violent conversion came to Sweden too. In the 1080s, King Inge decided to end the traditional pagan sacrifices at Uppsala. People didn't like that very much, and they forced him into exile, but he came back and burned down the new king's hall and set it on fire, and after that, pagan practices were outlawed. There were still a couple small portions, though, of Sweden that were still pagan, but in the 1100s, the Norwegian king Sigurd went on a crusade against Småland in Sweden and converted the pagans there. So that's about the last of the Germanic peoples that were still pagan in Europe. But paganism did not end there. These are just a couple examples that we have written records of, guys, but there would have been much more brutal things. But of course, people did not stop being pagan at these times. Paganism was still practiced, but it was practiced on the underground for many hundreds of years. We have laws in the 1200s all the way up to the 1800s prohibiting certain pagan beliefs and practices, and they were actually being enforced at the time too, so we know they were happening. We know there were still pagans around. This is what a lot of these witch trials were about, actually. They were not evil sorceresses, most of them. Some of them probably were, but most of them were probably just women trying to uphold ancient native traditions. See my video I did on that in the sources below. But I hope this helps, and these Germanic sources, remember, are just a fraction of a percent of all the horrible things that the church did around the world to convert the people. But I'm not blaming Christianity. I'm not saying anything against Christians, as I always make clear. Never said anything bad about modern day Christians or anyone who wants to be Christian. The enemy is not someone with different beliefs than us. There are plenty of times where Christians lived alongside pagans very peacefully in a great society. So it's not the religion that is the problem. The problem is trying to force your beliefs on others, which unfortunately is happening today more than any other time in history. And today it has nothing to do with religion. It's people trying to force other beliefs on those who disagree with them. So that philosophy of forcing your beliefs, believe me or else, this is the problem. So that's all for today. Hope that shed some light on things, but that's all I have to say about that. Vi ses nästa gång.